2020 is looking like it's going to set the high bar early. We have a sequel to literally this list's number 10 spot, and that's all just March. Well, it's way past March now. I bet you're all wondering how I think Doom Eternal compares to 2016. Well, worry not. I was going to be happy with Eternal if it was so much as a fraction as good as its predecessor, but sadly there was a possibility that Eternal could have missed that low bar. Great first impression game, but after I settled in a few levels, it soared past my expectations and only continued to rise as I played further. But did it reach the level the franchise set 4 years back? Before I answer that question, let me just clarify that regardless of whichever wins, Eternal is an excellent game in its own right and an impressive sequel, which only makes this coming battle all the more epic. Before I begin, let's lay a few ground rules first. There will be some parameters I will judge on, those being presentation, story, level design, enemies and bosses, weapon balancing, collectibles, and online. Of course, the game with more points once we're through will win the beam struggle. One last thing to be aware of, I will judge which game is superior to the other in each category, but I will also judge by how much it wins, or if it's a 50-50 tie. I could say one game wins 60-40, or 80-20, or even 100-0, though in this case, I doubt we'll see any harder of a victory than 70-30. Alright, now let's rip and tear into it. This will not be down to which game has the more detailed graphics, because naturally that should go to the newer game, with really nice set pieces, upgraded enemy designs, and even more brutal and admittedly hilarious glory kills. Eternal can't win with just this, however. If this were just a graphical update, then I would tie this category. Worry not, Eternal is much more than that. The levels each have very lively and immersive backdrops as early as the first. Not just that, but Eternal's variety in design is also a step up. 2016 may have looked great, but it could only really go so far with only really two types of level aesthetic: Red Wasteland and Facility. Whenever a facility took place outside, Mars didn't really look all that different from Hell. I guess you could say they were both pretty barren. Get it? Because there's a bear in a hell? Hell looks barren? Okay, fine, it wasn't that funny. Well, at least I got one laugh. Eternal has set aesthetics, but this time there's also a frozen wasteland. Thanks, I guess. An imperial-looking city above the clouds, and rooftops on Earth. That's just to name a few, even if some types are repeated. Sorry about that. Sound design is about the same for both games, but really, what changes did they really need to make? Okay, so other than sound, Eternal was a nice update. They went above and beyond to fix one of the few problems I had with Doom 2016. That said, there is one thing exclusive to 2016 that I wish they had kept. That being, when you die, there would be different clips that would play out of the demons dismantling you. Something I don't recall seeing in Eternal. I thought it was a nice touch, and with Eternal's attention to detail, the absence of these exclusive deaths is a bit shocking. But even with that, it was a small detail that doesn't really change the outcome. The first point goes to Eternal. I will just get the bad out the way. Story-wise, Doom Eternal feels like the third game of a trilogy, when in every other regard, it's the second. I couldn't help but feel like a lot happened in between the two games, and it doesn't make the in-betweens all that clear. Why is Samuel Hayden on my side? What am I even fighting? Who are you? While this game does provide interesting background on who the Doomslayer is and gives nice lore that ties into the classic games, it just wasn't necessary in my enjoyment of the game. On the contrary, Doom 2016's story was basic, but that was all I could really ask for. Not to mention, it was also a great example of how you can give life to a silent protagonist through action. Oh, and while we're on the subject of story, I have to bring up Samuel Hayden. While I already expressed my confusion for his role in Eternal's story, what made it worse was how much better he was in the previous game. He seemed to form a bond of sorts with the Doomslayer until he takes the Crucible at the end of the game. The cliche sequel setup ending only makes Eternal's payoff all the more disappointing. While they do try to do more with Eternal's story, 2016's is the more enjoyable and memorable tale. While this may not be the popular pick for some, this point goes to Doom 2016. Okay, this one is rather close, since both games are well crafted through and through in terms of design. There's not one arena in either game that felt badly designed in any way, shape, or form. The design of the levels in 2016 more than make up for the lacking in visual diversity. Even though the levels looked the same, they sure as hell didn't play the same. While level 5 looks like a foundry, you traverse upwards through small shafts. In other words, there's enough diversity in each level to set them apart. Not giving up the chase, Eternal adds a bunch of new gameplay mechanics onto itself to set it apart as a sequel. While present in 2016, there's a greater emphasis on platforming this time around, since you have the double jump right from the get-go and can dash. Adding to this further, the levels contain bars and grippable walls to do softcore parkour. Also new, but much less welcomed, is swimming. Honestly, the underwater sections really aren't that fun. Under normal circumstances, I could accept that there's no vertical swimming, except when some asshole at id Software decides to make these waters poisoned. That's right, we're in the year 2020, and a developer actually decided to combine water levels with time limits. On top of it being a frustrating experience, every time you come across water, the solution is always the same. You have to drain it. Not very intuitive, game. Thankfully, I don't find this to be a big deal because you only really come across 3 areas like this in the entire game. Eternal's platforming and other features were for the most part welcomed additions to help set this game apart. So who wins? Honestly, Eternal added things I didn't know I wanted to Doom. But that's just it. I didn't know platforming would have been a nice addition to 2016 because it gets the job done without it. Both games get their job done in their own right respectively. So if you had to force me to pick one, I'd look for the third solution. That means both. No clear advantages here. Both games have a nice variety with enemies. While Eternal takes some from its predecessor, it adds enough new faces to compensate. I really like the Doom Hunters, Pain Elementals, and the Arachnotrons, which each add a nice layer of strategy while not feeling like they take too much of your attention. Of course, I cannot say the same about the Marauder. These enemies are powerful and admittedly make for a great boss, but as a regular enemy, no. They are very complex and must be hit at certain intervals. Now before I get any of the "get good" comments, let me just say that these guys put up a fair 1v1 fight, but more often than not, you're fighting these guys with a bunch of other enemies with the Marauder taking up most of your attention. They're fast, have a varied moveset, and have a shield that deflects all your shots. You can only hit the Marauder when it charges up to swing attacks, at which point you need to be at a certain range for him to do that. This is a very unbalanced enemy that turns arena battles into a track race to wipe out the other enemies so you can actually put time into fighting the Marauder. These darn enemies show up just enough to where this can actually be a huge issue for me. The Archvile, who for a summoner enemy has far too much health, at least you can hit them with the BFG or Crucible. Doom 2016 on the other hand has no such balancing issue. Sure, the shield soldiers gave me trouble on my first playthrough, but they're nothing a stun bomb can't trivialize. As for bosses, oh boy, this is hard. While Eternal has more of them, I'm not particularly a fan of this style of bosses where there are tons of enemies around. Granted, the game uses the style very well, but there's just something special about fighting a boss with only the ammo you have with you and minimal health drops. Honestly, none of the Eternal bosses hold a candle to 2016's Cyber Demon. Having only 3 bosses wasn't exactly a flaw with 2016 when all 3 of them are phenomenal. I found Eternal's bosses to be consistently good, but 2016's roster was consistently great. In both enemies and bosses, I found that 2016 handled both a bit better. There are so many quality of life changes in Doom Eternal's weaponry that it almost makes me worried I'll not like 2016 going back to it. Let's start small. My favorite weapon in 2016 was the Gauss Cannon, and if you played the game, you'd know why. I've always described the Gauss Cannon as a mini BFG with a sniper attachment, and with more ammo, not to mention the insane speedrunning capabilities. However, it was changed in Eternal in favor of the Ballista, which was a bit weaker. I was a bit sad to see my favorite weapon go, but even I can't deny that it was a bit too good. There were a lot of healthy buffs, nerfs, and changes to various things to fine-tune the balance accordingly. While 7 of the 8 weapons have 2 variations, they were all useful. Well, except maybe the slow-ass microwave beam. Yeah, with 16 different variations, there was probably bound to be one that I found to be useless. But all is forgiven thanks to a lot of really cool add-ons, such as adding a grappling hook to the almighty super shotgun, giving an already excellent weapon some variety. That, along with the dashing, really helped with crowd control and navigation through enemy swarms. With all that said, however, the most important inclusion was enemy weak points. Breaking apart an Arachnotron's gun is so satisfying. Not to mention, it gives you more depth to how you can approach taking on the enemy swarms. The only one I'm kind of iffy about is bombing the Kako demons. You have to wait a second for the puff animation before dealing the glory kill every time, which, as we've established with the Marauder, every second counts. Nitpicking aside, these are absolutely welcomed additions. I even left out a few add-ons like the Flame Belch, which negates the starvation for armor, and the Ice Bonds, which stop really fast enemies so you can get a clear shot. You get the idea. Eternal wins by the closest we'll see to a landslide. For the most part, these games have similar collectibles, with a few exceptions. Both games have the weapon add-ons, upgrading your stats and nostalgia throwbacks, but Eternal adds many different add-ons like music, cheat codes, keys to find more suit upgrades, and unlockable perks for each add-on. I'd have to say my favorite of these collectibles is the Empyrean keys, which you get from clearing 6 really tough challenge maps. By collecting all 6 of them, you unlock the Unmaker, so perhaps that counts as another nostalgic throwback. So far this looks like a rather easy win for Doom Eternal, right? Well, no. In fact, I have a few issues with Eternal's add-ons. First, the Unmaker isn't a very rewarding weapon for all the trouble they put you through to get it. Since I'd rather just use the BFG instead, they really should have made this weapon stronger to serve as an accolade. A little overpowered even. This didn't strike me as too big of a deal since I enjoyed those challenge maps despite how hard they were, but that doesn't compare to my biggest issue. While there are plenty of things to collect in the game, in far too many instances, I couldn't help but feel like many of these were just handed to you. While you do get the first stat upgrade in 2016 for free, the rest are up to you to find, and they're pretty well hidden all things considered, making each find significantly more rewarding. Too many of Eternal's collectibles range from either being too easy to find, to not even trying to hide, which to me takes away half the fun of finding collectibles. This was a huge letdown for me personally. Many of you might not agree with this, but I found it dampened the collectibles quite a bit. If they would have put more thought into hiding the collectibles, then Eternal would have had this point. But Doom was methodical enough with its collectible placements to earn this victory. Don't worry, I'll try to keep this one brief. While the multiplayer isn't what most people play Doom for, Eternal makes its multiplayer known. The difference in the games here is how, like Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing was a clear Mario Kart clone, while the sequel strived to have its own identity. The multiplayer in 2016 wasn't bad. In fact, I actually found quite a bit of enjoyment out of it. It just felt a bit too much like other FPS games. There were a few nuances to set it apart, like addition of demons, but they were really unbalanced and felt more like a gimmick. Eternal, on the other hand, managed to make this into an even playing field, making the demon play much more involved. Add on a far more expansive customization range, and you have a mode that doesn't just feel like it's there for the sake of having a multiplayer component. Not by a landslide, yet still a clear victory for Eternal. Well, looks like we have ourselves a tie. Doom 2016 managed to edge out story and extras with a more substantial win in enemies and bosses, while Eternal had the win in presentation, weaponry, and online, with a tie in level design. In this case, it really does boil down to what you prefer from a video game and/or shooter. With that, I can say with confidence that Eternal did live up to one of the best games of last decade, which now that I think about it, Doom probably deserved to be raised higher. Now what do I think? From the category wins, I'm going to have to say I prefer Doom 2016 just ever so slightly more than Eternal. Doom is one of my favorite games of all time for having a simplistic and enjoyable story that's easy to follow, and some of the most consistent fun I've had from a game. Substantial highlights include the previously mentioned Cyber Demon boss fight, and the first level in Hell. This is still a tie at the end of the day, and Eternal's quality of life changes, as well as trying to go above and beyond to fix any errors the previous game may have had, makes it an incredible sequel that stands as 2016's equal. So, I hope you all enjoyed my first spin on a battle review. It's strange to start with a neck-and-neck battle with no defined winner. Perhaps I can change that for next time.